They were kids, but the courts saw killers, and the punishment was death. In this video, we uncover the most chilling, controversial, and overlooked executions in American history, not of career criminals or lifelong offenders, but of teenagers. You may believe in justice, but by the end of this list, you'll be forced to ask, was it justice or just vengeance with paperwork? Case 1. George Stinney. He was 14 years old, black, poor, and accused of murdering 2 white girls in the Jim Crow South. George Stinney was born on October 21st, 1929, in the small, segregated mill town of Alcolu, South Carolina. He lived in a modest company house with his parents and siblings. His father worked at the local lumber mill. In 1944, his name would become etched in history, not for what he did, but for what was done to him. The crime was brutal. 2 young white girls, Betty June Binnicker, age 11, and Mary Emma Thames, age 7, were found dead in a ditch near the railroad tracks. Their skulls had been crushed by a railroad spike. According to investigators, George had been seen talking to the girls earlier that day as they passed by his home, asking about wildflowers. That was the last confirmed sighting. Police questioned George without a lawyer, without his parents, and without a written record. After hours, they announced he had confessed. There was no signed statement. No physical evidence linked him to the crime. No clear motive was established. Just a verbal admission, claimed, not documented, from a 14-year-old under duress. He was arrested and held without formal counsel. Within weeks, the case moved to trial. George Stinney's trial lasted less than 3 hours on April 24th, 1944. An all-white, all-male jury deliberated for 10 minutes. The defense, appointed by the court, offered no witnesses and did not cross-examine the prosecution's witnesses. The prosecution relied entirely on the alleged confession, presented through the testimony of police officers. The courtroom was filled with spectators. George's family had fled the town under threats of mob violence. The boy stood alone. The jury returned a verdict, guilty of murder. No appeal was filed, as the defense did not request one. Sentencing was immediate. The punishment, death by electric chair. George was transferred to the South Carolina State Penitentiary in Columbia. He was the youngest person in 20th century U.S. history to be executed. On June 16, 1944, 83 days after the murders, George Stinney was strapped into the electric chair. The executioners struggled. The adult-sized straps didn't fit his 95-pound frame. They used a Bible as a booster seat. He wore a hood that slipped from his face during the first jolt, revealing tears streaming down his cheeks. Witnesses described his tiny body convulsing violently as the electricity surged through him. He was declared dead at 7:30 p.m. No final words were recorded. His last meal is unknown. For decades, the case remained buried, a footnote in history, rarely revisited. But in 2014, 70 years after his execution, South Carolina Circuit Court Judge Carmen Mullen vacated George Stinney's conviction. She cited a clear violation of due process, no meaningful defense, no effective counsel, and a coerced confession. The confession was deemed unreliable, with evidence suggesting it was fabricated or coerced. The trial was ruled legally indefensible. The state had, in effect, executed a child without a fair trial. George Stinney was officially exonerated. His name now stands as one of the starkest examples of injustice in American legal history, not because of what he did, but because of what was never proven and what was never undone. Case 2. Dalton Prejean. He was 17 years old when he pulled the trigger. 6 years later, he would die for it. Dalton Prejean was born in Lafayette, Louisiana, in 1959. His early life was marked by instability, a fractured home, a background of neglect, and frequent run-ins with law enforcement before he reached adulthood. He had been in and out of juvenile institutions since the age of 12. On July 2nd, 1977, Prejean was a passenger in a car involved in a traffic violation. The vehicle was pulled over by Louisiana State Trooper Donald Cleveland, a 29-year-old officer and father. As Trooper Cleveland approached, Prejean exited the car and shot him twice with a .38 caliber revolver, once in the chest and once in the head. The officer died on the scene. According to reports, the act was deliberate and unprovoked. Prejean fled, but was captured shortly afterward. The state charged him with first-degree murder. He was 17 years and 7 months old. The trial began in 1978. Prosecutors sought the death penalty, citing the cold nature of the act and Prejean's prior criminal behavior. The defense argued diminished capacity, pointing to his troubled upbringing, psychological instability, and an IQ of 76, placing him in the borderline intellectual functioning range. Despite these claims, the jury found him competent to stand trial. Dalton Prejean was convicted and sentenced to death by electrocution. The appeals process stretched on for several years. His legal team argued that executing a juvenile with cognitive impairments violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. In 1989, the U.S. Supreme Court reviewed the case in Stanford v. Kentucky, which included Prejean's appeal, and upheld the constitutionality of executing juveniles aged 16 or older at the time of their crime. Louisiana moved forward with the date. On May 18, 1990, Dalton Prejean was led into the execution chamber at Angola State Penitentiary. He was 30 years old. Strapped into the electric chair, he became the second person in Louisiana since the reinstatement of capital punishment in 1976 to be executed for a crime committed as a juvenile. The current surged through his body shortly after midnight. He was pronounced dead at 12:12 a.m. Prejean's final meal consisted of steak, baked potato, peas, salad, apple pie, and a soft drink. A standard request, no alterations, no special notes. His final words, however, were recorded. "I want to tell my family I love them. I have peace in my heart, and I'm not afraid to die." He also apologized to the Cleveland family. Whether accepted or not, the words were said. Dalton Prejean was a teenager when he took a life, but he died as an adult, bound to a chair, silenced by a law that saw no difference. Case 3. Charles Rumbaugh. He was calm, polite, and completely certain that he deserved to die. Charles was born in Texas in 1958. He grew up in a working-class household with no significant history of abuse, trauma, or diagnosed mental illness. But by age 17, he was already living on the edges of society, armed, detached, and increasingly dangerous. On August 4th, 1975, in San Angelo, Texas, Rumbaugh entered a jewelry store under the guise of browsing. Rumbaugh produced a firearm and attempted to rob the store. Inside was 51-year-old store owner Michael Fiorillo. He shot Fiorillo point-blank in the chest, killing him on the spot, then fled. Just days before, Rumbaugh had already carried out a separate armed robbery at a motel in the same town. In that case, he pistol-whipped the clerk and escaped with cash. Rumbaugh was arrested shortly after the jewelry store murder. He was found with the murder weapon still in his possession and items linking him to both crimes. Police reported no resistance during his arrest. In fact, he allegedly confessed immediately. The trial was swift. Despite his age, 17 years and 4 months, Rumbaugh was tried as an adult under Texas law. Prosecutors argued the act was not only deliberate, but remorseless. He offered no defense. In fact, during sentencing, he asked the court to give him the death penalty. He got his wish. Rumbaugh was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death by lethal injection. And unlike most on death row, he didn't fight it. On September 11th, 1985, at age 27, Charles Rumbaugh became the first juvenile offender executed in Texas since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. Lethal injection was administered at the Huntsville unit. He was declared dead at 12:15 a.m. His last meal was basic: a hamburger, French fries, and iced tea. He declined dessert. His final words were calm and brief. "I deserve this. Tell my family I love them. I hope this gives peace to the victim's family. That's all." Charles Rumbaugh didn't ask for mercy, and the system didn't offer it. Case 4. Glenn McGinnis. He was 17, black, poor, alone, raised by relatives, passed between homes, and dropped into the cracks of a system that offered more survival than structure. Glenn McGinnis was born in 1973 in Texas. His mother struggled with addiction. His father was absent. By his teenage years, Glenn was already on the margins. School was inconsistent, guidance was scarce, and petty crime became routine. But on August 1st, 1990, a petty act turned irreversible. It was just after 6 p.m. McGinnis walked into a small dry cleaning store in Conroe, Texas. There were no cameras, no security guard. Only 30-year-old Leta Ann Wilkerson, a store clerk and mother of 2. According to reports, McGinnis pulled a .25 caliber pistol and demanded money. The exact events that followed are still debated, but one fact is not. Wilkerson was shot in the head. She died instantly. The register was emptied. McGinnis fled the scene. Witnesses outside the store noted his description. He was arrested shortly after, the murder weapon still in his possession. Ballistics matched the gun to the bullet that killed Wilkerson. The motive was robbery. The result was a homicide. Despite being 17, McGinnis was charged as an adult under Texas law. The prosecution pursued capital murder and death. In 1992, Glenn McGinnis was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. Appeals followed. His lawyers highlighted his youth, his remorse, his potential for rehabilitation. They cited the evolving understanding of adolescent brain development and the growing unease over executing juvenile offenders. The courts rejected every appeal. On January 25, 2000, Glenn McGinnis was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. He was 27 years old. 10 years had passed since the day of the crime. He did not resist. He did not speak during transport. His final meal was modest: fried chicken, French fries, and peach cobbler. He finished the meal in silence. Before the injection, he made a final statement. "I hope my death gives peace to the family. I'm sorry for what I've done. That's all." At 6:21 p.m., Glenn McGinnis was pronounced dead. The execution didn't spark protests, but years later, his name would be cited in legal briefs, policy debates, and academic research focused on juvenile capital punishment. He wasn't a serial killer. He wasn't the youngest on record, but his case reminded many of the thin line between young enough to be lost and old enough to be killed. Glenn McGinnis died for a crime he committed as a teenager. And the question still lingers: should the law treat boys like men when it never gave them the chance to be either? Case 5. Johnny Frank Garrett. He was born into poverty, surrounded by chaos, abuse, and neglect. By age 17, Johnny Frank Garrett was already institutionalized. Garrett grew up in Amarillo, Texas. Reports later revealed a troubled childhood, marked by repeated trauma, substance abuse, and cognitive delays. But none of that would matter once the crime occurred. On October 31st, 1981, the body of 76-year-old Sister Tadea Benz was found in her room at the St. Francis Convent in Amarillo. She had been raped, strangled, and left partially clothed. The crime shocked the local community and sparked immediate media attention. Garrett, then 17, lived across the street from the convent. He was arrested just days later based on fingerprints lifted from a window screen and a knife reportedly found in his possession that was linked to the scene. He confessed during police interrogation, though later claimed the statement was coerced. There were no eyewitnesses. The rape and murder of a nun inside a convent became the focal point of the prosecution's case. They emphasized the brutality, the nature of the crime, and the symbolic violation of sacred ground. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Garrett was convicted of capital murder. He was sentenced to death. In the years that followed, his case moved through multiple appeals. His attorneys cited neurological impairment, a history of mental illness, and a coercive interrogation. They raised concerns about ineffective counsel and untested DNA evidence. All appeals were denied. The state of Texas moved forward with execution. On February 11, 1992, Johnny Frank Garrett was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit. He was 28 years old, 11 years after the crime that put him there. His final meal was ice cream, which he requested. As he lay strapped to the gurney, Garrett spoke directly. "I'd like to thank my family for loving me and taking care of me, and the rest of the world can kiss my ever-loving ass, because I'm innocent." He was pronounced dead at 12:20 a.m. Garrett's execution did not pass without controversy. His case became the subject of documentaries, investigative reports, and legal reviews. Many focused on the possibility of a wrongful conviction. Later, DNA testing in 2004 connected another man to similar crimes in the area, though no conclusive evidence overturned Garrett's conviction. Questions were raised, not just about guilt, but about whether a 17-year-old with a documented mental disability should have ever been eligible for death row. At 17, Garrett entered the justice system with no defense left but time. And when that ran out, no one could stop the needle. Case 6. Douglas Christopher Thomas. He was 17, a high school dropout, and in love with a girl whose home had become a war zone. Douglas Christopher Thomas was born in Virginia in 1973. Described by peers as quiet and unremarkable, he fell hard for 14-year-old Jessica Wiseman. Their relationship, however, was not welcomed by her parents. According to court testimony, the home Jessica lived in was tense, reportedly abusive, a place she had threatened to run away from more than once. In late 1990, that tension turned fatal. On the night of November 9th, 1990, Douglas Thomas entered the Wiseman home carrying a shotgun. Jessica's parents, James and Kathy Wiseman, were shot in their bed. James was killed instantly. Kathy survived and later testified against Thomas. Prosecutors argued the plan was deliberate. They claimed Thomas and Jessica conspired together to eliminate the parents so they could stay together. The shotgun used in the murder belonged to Thomas's family. Jessica initially told police she had nothing to do with the crime. Later, she admitted to encouraging Thomas, but claimed no direct role. Because of her age, she was sentenced to a juvenile facility and released at 21. Thomas, at 17, was tried as an adult. The trial began in 1991. The prosecution painted a picture of manipulation and premeditation, highlighting the stolen weapon, the motive, and Thomas's confession. The defense cited Thomas's immaturity and emotional vulnerability, arguing he was influenced by Jessica's desperation and their unhealthy relationship. Despite his age, the jury returned a death sentence. Appeals followed. They focused on Thomas's age, the influence of his underage girlfriend, and the rapidly shifting legal standards surrounding juvenile executions. In 1999, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to intervene. On January 10, 2000, Douglas Thomas was executed by lethal injection at Greensville Correctional Center in Virginia. He was 26 years old, he had spent nearly a decade on death row for a crime committed before his 18th birthday. For his final meal, Thomas requested pizza, fried chicken, a cheeseburger, and a Pepsi. It was granted. His last words were brief. "I'm sorry to the Wiseman family for the pain I've caused them." That's it. The execution of Douglas Thomas reignited debates around the ethics of executing juvenile offenders, especially in cases involving emotional manipulation and co-defendants under the age of legal responsibility. His case became part of the national dialogue that would eventually lead to the 2005 Supreme Court ruling banning the death penalty for those under 18 at the time of their crimes. Douglas Thomas didn't live to see that change, but his name became part of the reason it happened. Case 7. Ruben Cantu. He was 17 when the crime occurred, 19 when he was sentenced, and 26 when the state of Texas took his life for a murder he may not have committed. Ruben Montoya Cantu was born in San Antonio in 1966. By all accounts, he was a restless teenager, living in a rough part of town, prone to trouble, and known to police. The crime took place on November 8, 1984, during a late-night robbery at a San Antonio construction site. Two men were there, Pedro Gomez and Juan Moreno, both undocumented workers living temporarily on the property. According to court records, two teens broke in, demanding money. One of them carried a rifle. Pedro Gomez was shot 9 times and killed. Juan Moreno was shot as well, but survived. Weeks later, Ruben Cantu, 17, was arrested and charged with capital murder. The case was built primarily on Moreno's eyewitness testimony. At trial, Moreno identified Cantu as the shooter. There was no physical evidence linking Cantu to the scene. No fingerprints, no weapon recovered. At trial, the state portrayed Cantu as a violent, remorseless youth. The jury deliberated and returned a death sentence. Cantu's appeals centered around the lack of physical evidence and questions about the reliability of Moreno's identification. Each appeal was denied. The conviction and sentence stood. On August 24, 1993, Ruben Cantu was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. He was 26 years old. According to reports, he requested a final meal of fried chicken, biscuits, and iced tea. His final words were direct. "I am innocent. I never killed anyone. I'm being punished for something I did not do. I hold no grudges. I forgive everyone." He was pronounced dead at 12:09 a.m. But what came later would cast a long shadow over the case. Years after the execution, Juan Moreno recanted his testimony. He stated publicly that he had been pressured by police to identify Cantu, and that, at the time, he was uncertain. He now believed the wrong person had been executed. A former co-defendant, David Garza, also admitted that Cantu was not with him during the crime. Despite these claims, no formal retrial was possible, because Ruben Cantu was already dead. Ruben Cantu was 17 when he was accused of murder. He was executed 9 years later, still proclaiming his innocence. And though the debate continues, one fact remains. You can't appeal from the grave. Case 8. Toronto Patterson. He was 17 when the crime occurred, and 24 when the state carried out the sentence. Toronto Patterson was born in Texas in 1978. Raised in Dallas, he was known as a quiet teenager with no prior serious criminal record. But on one night in 1995, his actions placed him at the center of one of the most disturbing juvenile capital cases in the state's modern history. The incident took place on June 2nd, 1995. Patterson, then 17, entered the home of his cousin, 34-year-old Kimberly Brewer, with a 9mm semi-automatic pistol. Inside were 3 individuals: Brewer herself, her 8-year-old daughter, Jennifer, and her 3-year-old niece, Ollie. Patterson had reportedly been in a dispute with Brewer over a car transaction. According to court records, he believed she had cheated him out of a sale. During the confrontation, Patterson shot and killed Kimberly Brewer. He then turned the gun on the children, 8-year-old Jennifer and 3-year-old Ollie. Both were shot multiple times. Only one person in the house survived, a 9-year-old girl who played dead and later identified Patterson as the shooter. He fled the scene, but was arrested shortly afterward. The weapon was recovered. Ballistics matched it to the bullets found at the crime scene. Patterson was charged with capital murder. Despite being 17 at the time of the offense, he was certified to stand trial as an adult. At trial, the prosecution emphasized the calculated nature of the attack and the vulnerability of the victims, particularly the children. The defense presented evidence of Patterson's age and lack of criminal history. There was no claim of mental illness or coercion. The jury deliberated and returned a guilty verdict. Toronto Patterson was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Public reaction was divided. Some viewed the sentence as appropriate due to the nature of the victims. Others raised concern about the execution of a person for a crime committed while still legally a minor. On August 28, 2002, Patterson was executed at the Huntsville unit in Texas. He was 24 years old. His final meal included fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, a roll, iced tea, and chocolate cake. In his final statement, he said, "I want to tell my family that I love them and I want to thank my attorney. And to the family of the victims, I am sorry for what I did. I'm not proud of it." He was pronounced dead at 6:20 p.m. Case 9, Napoleon Beasley. He was a high school senior, honor student, athlete, and at age 17, Napoleon Beasley made a decision that would end one life, and eventually his own. Born in 1976 in Tyler, Texas, Beasley was a teenager with a future. He came from a middle-class background, had no history of violent crime, and was college-bound. But on a spring evening in 1994, everything changed. On April 19, 1994, Beasley and two friends drove from Tyler to the city of Tyler, Texas. Their goal was robbery. Their target, a car, a black Mercedes-Benz, parked outside a home in a quiet neighborhood. The car belonged to John Luttig, a 63-year-old businessman and father of federal Judge J. Michael Luttig. As Luttig exited his vehicle in the driveway, Beasley approached with a .45 caliber pistol. He shot Luttig in the head twice, killing him instantly. He then attempted to shoot Luttig's wife, Bobby, who was nearby, but the gun jammed. She survived and called for help. Beasley fled the scene, but was arrested shortly afterward. He admitted to the killing and the attempted robbery. At trial, prosecutors presented a clear case of premeditated capital murder during the commission of a robbery. Beasley's age, 17 at the time of the offense, allowed prosecutors under Texas law to seek the death penalty. The jury found him guilty. He was sentenced to death by lethal injection in 1995. Beasley's appeals emphasized his age, clean record, and potential for rehabilitation. Supporters pointed to racial disparities in sentencing. Beasley, a black teenager, had killed a prominent white victim with close connections to the federal judiciary. Several current and former judges, including some on the U.S. Supreme Court, publicly expressed discomfort with the sentence. Despite that, all appeals were denied. On May 28, 2002, Napoleon Beasley was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. He was 25 years old. He declined to make a special meal request. The standard prison meal was served. In his final statement, Beasley said, "The act I committed was not to hurt anyone. It was out of greed and immaturity. I'm sorry for the pain I caused the Luttig family. I love my family, and I hope for peace for everyone." He was pronounced dead at 6:17 p.m. Napoleon Beasley's execution sparked widespread public discourse on the ethical boundaries of capital punishment for juvenile offenders. His case was cited in legal arguments and academic discussions, leading up to the 2005 Supreme Court decision that abolished the death penalty for crimes committed under the age of 18. At the time of his death, that ruling didn't exist. And for Napoleon Beasley, the law came just a few years too late. Case 10. J. Kelly Pinkerton. J. Kelly Pinkerton was born in Texas in 1962. By age 17, he was already known to local law enforcement for petty crimes and disturbances. But in 1979, his name would become tied to something far more serious, a pair of murders that would make him one of the youngest people sentenced to death in the United States at the time. The first crime occurred on October 26, 1979 in Amarillo, Texas. Pinkerton broke into the home of Sarah Welch, a 30-year-old furniture store employee. According to forensic reports, she was stabbed repeatedly during the attack and died from multiple wounds. There were signs of sexual assault and a forced entry. 7 months later, on April 10, 1980, Pinkerton committed a second similar offense. He entered the home of Sherry Welch, a 25-year-old woman, through a window. She was found stabbed and mutilated, with circumstances nearly identical to the first crime. DNA evidence was not available at the time, but hair samples, along with items found in Pinkerton's possession, tied him to both scenes. He was arrested shortly after the second murder and charged with capital murder. The trial moved quickly. Prosecutors argued the murders were premeditated and carried out with deliberate cruelty. The similarities between the two attacks painted a clear pattern. Pinkerton was tried as an adult, despite being 17 during both killings. The jury deliberated for just over an hour. He was convicted on multiple counts of capital murder and sentenced to death. His appeals spanned several years. Lawyers argued that he had been denied proper consideration due to his age and psychological history, including evidence of emotional instability. All appeals were ultimately denied. On May 15, 1986, J. Kelly Pinkerton was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. He was 24 years old, making him one of the youngest people executed in the United States since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. Reports indicate he requested a final meal of a cheeseburger, French fries, and a milkshake. No unusual items were noted. As he lay strapped to the gurney, Pinkerton said, "Be strong for me. I want you to know I'm at peace with myself and my God. I hope you find peace too." He was pronounced dead at 12:19 a.m. The case of J. Kelly Pinkerton attracted limited public attention after his death. But in legal circles, it has been revisited as part of a broader examination of juvenile executions carried out during the 1980s, a period when several offenders under 18 were sentenced to death under rapidly changing legal and social standards. His execution occurred nearly 2 decades before the Supreme Court's 2005 decision in Roper versus Simmons, which barred the death penalty for crimes committed by individuals under 18. By that time, Pinkerton's story was already closed. No further investigation was opened, and his name remains one of the final entries on a list that would later be ruled unconstitutional. Case 11. Sean Sellers. He was 16 years old, a self-proclaimed satanist, and the only person in modern U.S. history executed for a crime committed while under the age of 17 after the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. Sean Richard Sellers was born in 1969 and raised in Oklahoma. His early years were marked by instability, emotional volatility, and an escalating obsession with the occult. By the time he reached his mid-teens, he was heavily involved in what he described as satanic rituals. He kept a diary, wrote about demons, and said he believed he was possessed. What followed was one of the most controversial juvenile homicide cases in American legal history. The first killing happened on September 8, 1985. Sellers entered a Circle K convenience store in Oklahoma City, where 32-year-old Robert Bauer was working the night shift. Bauer had previously refused to sell him beer. Sellers returned later with a .44 caliber revolver and shot Bauer in the head, killing him instantly. There was no robbery, no warning. Months later, on March 5, 1986, Sellers turned on his own family. He entered the home he shared with his mother and stepfather while they were asleep. At close range, he shot both Vonda Bellofato, his mother, and Paul Lee Bellofato, his stepfather, in the head. They died instantly. Sellers claimed afterward that he was under the control of a demon named Ezurate. He also cited influences from satanic writings and heavy metal lyrics, though later he would say he had converted to Christianity while on death row. The trial was swift. Despite being only 16 at the time of the murders, Oklahoma prosecutors charged Sellers as an adult. He was found competent to stand trial and was convicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder. The court rejected his insanity defense. His claims of demonic possession were dismissed as fabricated or exaggerated. In 1986, Sean Sellers was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Appeals followed for over a decade. His defense attorneys cited his age, mental health history, and subsequent religious conversion. International human rights groups, religious leaders, and even the American Bar Association petitioned for clemency. All requests were denied. On February 4, 1999, Sean Sellers was executed at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. He was 29 years old. He was the first person executed in the U.S. in 40 years for a crime committed at age 16. His final meal included Chinese food, egg rolls, sweet and sour shrimp, fried rice, and a cherry limeade. His last words were recorded as, "All the people that are hating me right now and are here to watch me die, I don't hate you. To my family and my mother's family and my stepfather's family and Robert Bauer's family, I'm sorry for the pain I caused you. I have peace now." He was pronounced dead at 12:17 a.m. Sean Sellers' execution remains one of the most cited juvenile capital punishment cases in U.S. legal history. His case was frequently referenced in both domestic and international debates, leading up to the 2005 Supreme Court decision in Roper v. Simmons, which abolished the death penalty for crimes committed by individuals under 18. By then, Sellers was already gone, but his case left behind a question that still lingers in legal circles. Should the law view a 16-year-old killer as fully accountable, or as a child shaped by chaos, condemned by timing? From George Stinney to Sean Sellers, these cases reveal how the American justice system once approached juvenile capital punishment. While the law has since changed, these executions continue to raise questions. Where does justice end and retribution begin? Can a child truly be beyond rehabilitation? For more cases like these, subscribe to this channel and explore our full archive. Each story is real. Each sentence, final. See you on the next one.